Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. In the last few days, I've been immersing myself in the new HalfLife Alex game. Alex game. I don't know what it's called, but it's the VR game and it's completely blown me away. I mean, I'm pretty familiar with VR. I'm not an early adapter, but I keep up to date with all the latest news and games. But up until now, no talented AAA developer has made a major game exclusively for this format. I mean, we have had Skyrim and Fallout 4 for VR, but you can tell these games are clunky and not natively made for the format. Then there are games like Pavlov or Blade and Sorcery, which focus heavily on VR gameplay mechanics, but lack pretty much everything else. And so when I started playing HalfLife Alex, I quickly realized that Valve had once again raised the bar and set a new standard for gaming. Alex is a combination of beautiful design, graphics, immersion, and gameplay mechanics wrapped together in a way I always knew was possible for the VR platform, but had almost given up hope seeing. There were moments in this game that I literally just paused what I was doing and just started staring at the world around me in wonderment of how well they've crafted it all. And I've never been more scared in a video game than when a head crab jumps onto my face. But just like how the game is hiding headcrabs from us, the VR technology is also hiding an ugly truth. Most VR games are downright graphically ugly, especially when compared to their desktop counterparts. And it's not only because VR games lack large budgets and full teams of artists backing them, it's also because 3D gaming takes a lot of computing power. You have to render the game from two separate angles for both eyes at a relatively high frame rate unless you want to be violently ill. Plus, you can never really cram in enough pixels into a screen when it's only a few inches from your face. Which is why VR is not exactly a system that has been fully embraced by consumers yet, and therefore most developers are hesitant at investing in it. Of course, Valve, creators of HalfLife Alex, also have their own VR platform, so they definitely have some skin in the game. And so when I say HalfLife Alex sets a new bar in gaming standards, I mean VR gaming standards. Had it been released on PC or on consoles, Alex would have still been an amazing game, but it would have seen much stiffer competition. Prey and Metro Exodus are two names that immediately stand out in recent years that have a very similar vibe. And that's when I noticed something strange about all of the recent games that have visually stunned me. These games stood out not because of some massive leap in graphics technology, but instead as a result of great art direction, smart game design, or in Alex's case, fulfilling the potential of an underserved gaming platform. Which brings me to this question that I've had in the back of my mind for quite some time, and that's, is advancements in graphics plateauing? Growing up, my life was categorized into different periods of time, not based on who was in the White House or what war our country was involved in, but on the gaming system that was currently available. My first real system, aside from MS-DOS, was Sega Genesis. I got it in 1993 in a special bundle with Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and that was basically the only game I played for several years. After the Genesis period, I entered the PlayStation period in 1999. We didn't have a lot of money back then, so we always got the consoles late and we rarely ever got new games. PlayStation 1 was my first introduction to 3D gaming, through titles like Spyro the Dragon, Crash Bandicoot, Medal of Honor, and Game Day 98. It was also my introduction to CDs, which were basically like the worst things in the world. They would scratch extremely easily, and then you kind of had to place them inside of a freezer and pray to the freezer gods and hope that their magical properties would fix it. But then 2000 arrived. I clearly remember walking in the mall and seeing a PlayStation 2 on display. I was completely floored by how photorealistic everything was looking. The game they were playing was Madden 2001 with Eddie George on the front cover, and yes, the curse got him that year. I was really into football back then, so much so that I would make my entire Pee Wee football team's roster in video games. So having Madden 2001 became a huge deal after seeing how realistic it looked. Now, at the time, I only had a PS1 still, and I didn't really grasp how important the hardware in these systems were. I thought all I had to do to get the best and latest graphics from a game was to buy the latest game. And I was completely wrong about that and disappointed to find out that Madden 2001 on PS1 looked nothing like Madden 2001 on PS2. Now, looking back at these two side-by-side images, the differences aren't that great, but back then, you could really see the differences between one console to another. I remember being so depressed about how terrible my PS1 looked, and I realized that I probably wouldn't be getting another console system for a pretty long time. And perhaps it's because I have such an emotional connection during this period of time that I remember how big the jump in graphics were as well. The early 2000s was an amazing time to be a gamer. We had the beginning of online gaming. I remember playing Battlefield 1942 and World of Warcraft for hundreds of hours. And it was also around this time that I first started hearing the word photorealistic being applied to gaming. I was also first exposed to the Final Fantasy series in Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X was probably one of the most visually stunning games out at the time. And I was pretty impressed with everything I was seeing. In a decade, we went from 8-bit 2D side-scrollers to 3D games that looked almost real. And then from 2000 to 2010, we saw the gaming industry consolidate and mature. Several passionate and talented medium-sized developers were swallowed up by industry giants, leaving us with the Ubisofts and EAs of today. But the advances in graphics were no less significant than the ones that were reached in the previous 10 years. In 2007, the game Crysis came out, and it was ridiculous how much computing power you needed to play it. It became the ultimate benchmark of whether your PC was awesome or not. And the funny thing was, no consumer PC could really handle the game at ultra settings during its release. It had all sorts of incredible features like volumetric clouds, real-time ambient lighting, depth of field, realistic shadows, motion blurring on character models. It also signaled the beginning of the 1080p era for gaming. Even today, in 2020, a lot of PC gamers, especially those on laptops, will have a hard time playing Crysis on ultra setting, which is problematic and based on my observations when this plateauing most likely first started. Take a look at another game that now is a decade old, Battlefield 3. When it came out, its single-player campaign was epic. You had incredible moments like launching off of an aircraft carrier in the middle of a storm, or thundering through the desert in a column of tanks. The game does an especially good job at generating weather effects and atmospheric lighting. But then let's compare something more modern like Battlefield 5 to Battlefield 3, and the differences are a lot smaller between the quality of the visuals. Sure, ray tracing, which is now available thanks to the new line of RTX graphics cards, looks nothing short of amazing, especially if you have time to slow down and admire all those reflections. And 4K gaming is a massive increase in resolution from 1080p. But are the improvements from Battlefield 3 to Battlefield 5 as great as the improvements we made from 2D gaming to 3D gaming? In my opinion, there is a little bit of plateauing here. But there are a lot of factors, I think, involved in this conversation, starting out with personal experience and bias, which we all have to remove in order to get an objective truth. For instance, when I was young, I would end up playing the same game for a very long period of time, simply because I wasn't an adult and I didn't have any money, so I couldn't really go out and buy every game I wanted to. My parents were the gatekeepers. As I've grown older and become an adult, kind of, I've had the freedom to play basically any game that I want to. This also happens to be precisely when I perceive that video game technology is plateauing. Which is when I realize it's very possible, because I'm playing more titles every year, I'm noticing less changes because these games are all made at the same time for very similar hardware. When I was young, I'd be lucky to get a new game every 6 months, so I can imagine how much greater the leaps in technology would have seemed at that age. Now, from a technical standpoint, there is something known as Moore's Law, proposed by Intel co-founder Gordon E. Moore in 1965. It theorizes that the number of transistors that can be packed into a certain area will double every 2 years. This means smaller and smaller chips that are more efficient and more powerful. Now, Moore's Law has held up for more than half a century, but today more and more computer experts are claiming that we've reached an end. This means that computer processing power no longer increases exponentially every few years. One of the issues today is that transistors in computer chips are so small and so densely packed on a chip that electrons are now skipping from one transistor to another. This is known as quantum tunneling, and it leads to computing errors because the signals are not going to the right location. And already CPU makers like Intel are looking at alternative solutions to making computers more powerful and not just relying on decreasing the size of their manufacturing abilities. Instead, they're looking into how to make their processors more efficient and pioneering new architectural designs within the chips. But this industry trend is decreasing the speed of development for more powerful GPUs and especially CPUs. Another big problem is consoles. The 4th generation of consoles were released in the late 80s. The 5th generation came in 1993, the 6th in 1998, the 7th in 2005, and the 8th in 2012. It seems like the trend is that the time between generations is increasing. From 4 years in between Generation 4 and 5 to 8 years now with PS5 and Xbox Series X releasing this winter. Console makers have a unique problem. It takes several years for companies to decide on what kind of hardware setup will be most future-proof and deliver good performance for the price. PC gamers don't have that issue and usually upgrade their systems whenever they want, usually with the latest hardware available. And because console players make up a huge percentage of video game sales, well, legal video game sales, developers have to make sure that whatever game they're making will also be available on consoles. This becomes a really big problem, especially at the end of any console's lifespan. Right now, the current generation we're in started in 2012 with the Xbox One, which has some really old technology inside of it. For instance, the GPU on the original Xbox One was only capable of 1.2 teraflops of floating point performance, whereas a modern GPU like the RTX 280 Super will have about 11.1 teraflops of floating point performance. That's a 10-time increase in GPU performance over the Xbox One. Now imagine having to design a game that will work with both systems. You're obviously going to have to cater to the much older and slower systems for things to work, which means you might not get the cutting-edge graphics that your better card can handle. And it's kind of frustrating. I mean, the last game I remember playing on my Xbox One was Red Dead Redemption 2, and that was because the console version was released a year earlier than the PC version, which looked visually much better. It's also been rumored that Cyberpunk 2077 was delayed from April to September of this year because of console optimization issues, primarily because of the original Xbox One again. Which would kind of suck if it were true, because with everyone trapped at home, Cyberpunk 2077 is just the type of escape we all need. But the good news is this current generation of consoles is almost over, and even if you don't really care about the next generation of consoles, it means that developers will have a lot more power to work with when they're designing new games. And perhaps they will once again be able to continue to push the boundaries of realism when it comes to gaming. Because the gaming industry is like any industry, it might be driven by advances in technology, but it's also driven by consumer tastes and what they're willing to pay. And while graphics are important, they aren't the only things that matter. Accessibility, for instance, can completely shift how game developers think, which is why the mobile gaming industry has taken off so quickly in the last few years. Mobile games are mostly very terrible and not very high quality, but everyone has a smartphone, which does make it appealing for game developers. So I don't really know how to answer this question. There definitely seems to be some plateauing in the advancement of graphics in the last 5 years, but there are also new formats like VR and AR, which are quite exciting and changing how we interact with, the gaming world. But let me know in the comment section below what you guys think. Are we plateauing, or are things going pretty well? Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. My name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie and you are the protagonist.